Thank you, Claudia, for this wonderful presentation, and congratulations on your award. It's my great pleasure to introduce our plenary speaker today. Thomas Bianchi is a scientist whose work has shaped our understanding of carbon cycling across aquatic ecosystems, from rivers and wetlands to estuaries and the coastal ocean. His research has helped many of us think more clearly about how these environments connect and why these connections matter. His path into aquatic science began long before his many titles. He grew up on Long Island, surrounded by water, playing basketball and playing the drums, and somewhere along the way, he developed a lasting interest in oceanography. That early curiosity eventually grew into a career that has influenced several generations of aquatic scientists. His academic journey took him from a master's in Ecology and Evolution at Stony Brook University to a Ph.D. In Marine Sciences at the University of Maryland. He followed this up by a postdoctoral fellowship at what is now the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies. From there, he moved through major professorships at Tulane University, at Texas A&M University, where he held the James R. Whatley Endowed Chair in Geosciences, and at the University of Florida, where he served as distinguished professor and held the John and Beverly Thompson Endowed Research Chair. Today, he is a research professor at the University of New Hampshire's Institute for the Study of Earth, Oceans, and Space. Across these roles, Tom has stayed focused on one central theme: how organic matter moves, changes, and influences aquatic environments. His work has helped us understand that the biogeochemical links between land and water, and has played a major role in shaping the modern study of the land-ocean-aquatic continuum. Many of the concepts we now take for granted in aquatic biogeochemistry trace back to his contributions. His scholarly impact includes more than 300 peer-reviewed papers, 9 books, and a significant editorial leadership, including his current role as editor-in-chief of Marine Chemistry. Through both his research and his editorial work, he has helped guide not only scientific directions, but also the broader conversations that shape our field. His recognitions reflect this impact. He is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Geochemical Society, the European Association of Geochemistry, ASLO, and the American Geophysical Union. He has received two Fulbright Research Awards, China's Qilu Friendship Medal, and in 2023 served as the Edward P. Bass Distinguished Visiting Environmental Scholar at Yale University. And this year, he received the Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky Medal from the European Geosciences Union, one of the highest honors in the Biogeosciences. But beyond the awards, what stands out most is how Tom's work helped us see aquatic systems as connected and dynamic. At a time of rapid environmental change, his research brings both clarity and urgency, reminding us that carbon cycling in aquatic critical zones is a key challenge of the 21st century, and one that requires us to think across traditional boundaries. His plenary today, Carbon Processing in Aquatic Critical Zones, Biogeochemical Challenges in the 21st Century, invites us to do exactly that. It asks us to consider how decades of biogeochemical research can help us understand the pressures facing aquatic systems today, and how that understanding can guide us toward a more resilient future. Please join me in welcoming a scientist whose work has shaped our understanding of aquatic carbon cycling for more than 3 decades, Thomas Bianchi.
Well, good morning. You know, the longer these introductions get, it just means that I'm just getting old, and it's just a nice way to say that. But yes, thank you for those kind words. I'm really happy to be back in Montreal. My son did his undergraduate in Concordia here, and I've always loved this city, and it's been too long since I had visited it, so it's nice to be back. I'd like to thank the organizing committee for inviting me. This is a real distinct honor. I've been to the ASLO meeting before, the summer ASLO meeting before, but I typically follow more the marine AGU ocean science meeting. But yes, it's a real pleasure to be here. I'd also like to just thank Roxanne Moranger. She's the one who reached out from the committee for convincing me that this would be a good place for me to give a talk about this. And I hope that you find what I'm about to share with you, maybe 3 decades of research in the aquatic continuum. And so some of it's freshwater, some of it moves out into the estuaries, and then of course a little bit on the shelf. So let's get started. I am what prevents you from getting to lunch right now. So I'll start with a little bit of the funding that I would like to acknowledge. I don't have a long list of people that I'll list, basically in terms of the people who've done the work out in the trenches. You'll see their faces and their names as I move through the slides, and those will be postdocs and graduate students and so on. So the outline looks something like this. We'll basically start with the definition and sort of ideas behind this aquatic continuum. I'll talk about mud as an important medium that controls kinetics. It's a very important medium that we talk about very casually in the sciences, and I've taken more time to think about it in its own unique properties. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about sort of how these pathways of mud deposition and carbon burial, how we're changing that in the Anthropocene. So let's first begin with, we talk about here this critical zone dynamics and the aquatic continuum. There's a lot of cycling as you go between the source to sink, the way geologists typically refer to this. And John Cole and a number of other people talked about the leaky pipes of inland waters as they transport material from the inland habitats, terrestrial systems to the coast. And you can see a lot of these effluxes of CO2 out. And so we'll be talking a little bit about some of the processes that control that, and then I'll spend a lot of time in this margin here where a lot of the carbon is buried. Within this particular continuum, there are what I'm referred to as these little critical zones, a little bit different than in what Conover traditionally defines for the terrestrial systems. But these are very steep gradients, and these gradients are things that we are creating as we build dams and channels and alter channels and things like that. That is what I mean when I talk about these aquatic critical zones. So another name, this would be someone that at the Ocean Sciences meeting would be maybe recognized more. I'm not sure how many people know John Hedges, but as I was coming up, a graduate student in the late 80s, I realized a lot of you out there hadn't been born yet. You don't need to remind me of that like all of the undergraduate students do when I teach them. But so basically that he wrote this paper that's a real benchmark paper. And coming up as a graduate student, I remember really being struck by what he thought were things that we needed to really spend more time on. One was sort of looking at what type of organic materials accumulate in deltaic systems. What factors control this transport? Is kerogen completely remineralized during the weathering, and what types of refractory molecules are made by plants, and how does that impact what is remineralized or taken up by microbes? So if you look at this is 1992, and we're still working on these things, and this really set the stage for pretty much 30 years of what I've been working on, a lot of these particular questions that John posed and so eloquently wrote about. I mean, you can see John died in his late 50s. A heart problem. He was taken from us far too early, but for those of you who don't know his work, you should have a look and go back. I mean, he was really, really one of the great minds of biogeochemistry and was a real leader. So, looking at Pierre Regnier's rendition of the land-ocean aquatic ecosystem here, again, you start with the sort of the longer-term carbon cycle of volcanism and basically the delivery or sort of the weathering of material, sorry. As that sort of longer-term carbon cycle integrates with more of the ecosystem level, so this is a much longer term, you start getting into the shorter term cycling. And what happens here is you have a lot of this material, this is what I was showing before, that before it even makes it to the coastline, it fluxes out as CO2. And then looking at what ultimately makes it to the coastline, some of these might be what you call blue carbon habitats, wetlands, and so on. And the coastal ocean is really quite important. So the numbers that I won't bore you with, this is really one of the more updated versions of the land-ocean system. As I said, about 80% of that terrestrial material that leaches out gets burned off. But one of the things, despite that loss, you get significant amounts of organic carbon buried in the coastal ocean. About 85% of all of the carbon burial in the ocean, all the oceans, is buried in the coastal margin. So this was always a really difficult thing for IPCC folks to sort of constrain. It was really not represented very well through much of my career. And we thought that this was really important to help constrain, since there's so much organic matter buried in this particular zone. But the numbers that we typically had lots of error bars. So one of the papers we published back in 2013, looking at this, points out that if you look at the industrial and post-industrial differences, post-industrial you get basically where the coastal ocean becomes more of a net sink. Some of that's related to the greening of the coastal ocean from eutrophication and so on. So you see much more export out from the coastal ocean to the open ocean. The other thing, aside from just looking at the mechanisms as this material moves from the inland waters through these various waterways, is to look at the pools of carbon. And that's another thing John Hedges was very interested in. How old is this material? How do we track terrestrial material? You can see the big pools here, again, of course, sedimentary rocks and petrogenic material is a very important thing that we'll talk about. Kerogen, really the largest pool of organic carbon on the planet. And then this ecosystem, more labile material that we were just talking about, the more bioavailable modern material. I won't talk about these deeper pools, but again, it's really in this region here that is quite important. So these are the hot spots that we'll be talking about today. I'll talk a little bit about the wetlands. I'll talk a little bit about deltas, fjords. I'll have just maybe a slide a little bit about permafrost in system we worked in Alaska, and so on. And the idea, I'm just going to sort of use these as small little vignettes, just a few slides for each one, and hopefully you see where I'm going with this. The whole idea is connecting them, and mud will be an important mediator that connects them. So what do these environments have in common? And that is essentially what I was just saying, very, very high concentrations of mud. This is something that Ed Deavy, for those of you who know was Evelyn Hutchinson's student at Yale, and he wrote a little bit about the whole uniqueness of mud back in the 70s. There have been features. Malakoff had a whole feature on mud. Of course, the mud is electric with the cable bacteria. And then we had this paper come out in 2024 that looks at how the Anthropocene is shaping how this material moves and what are the consequences of that. So when we talk about mud, we're talking about typically less than 60, 64 microns. And some of that material is sand, that organic matter that is associated with it. But the large portion of it is with mud. And you can see here that the amount of organic matter associated with mud increases very strongly. And so some of this bonding or this organo-mineral association is something that the soil people and the aquatic people have spent the last decade. There's a tremendous amount of work on the importance of organo-mineral protection when you had CO2 sequestration into terrestrial systems as it transports through the aquatic system. Is that material being protected from microbial decay? And Blair and Aller talked a little bit about this in a paper that looked at sort of all of these different pools of carbon that can become part of the phyllosilicate layers in clay particles, and how that particular bonding is important in protecting organic matter for long periods of time. So again, just with respect to sequestration and the way we look at that as a very important factor right now as we distribute olivine and other to enhance weathering across the planet in different areas. This is sort of the whole idea behind some of that. And basically the interactions with mineral surfaces vary based on the bond strength that different molecules have with different minerals. So there's a lot of detail into this that we won't go into today. So just to remind a few of the folks, students and others, that we're on the same page, of course, one of the other important things, aside from organo-mineral protection in controlling carbon burial, is redox. And you have sort of the classic redox profile here, more efficient oxidative breakdown compared to low oxygen conditions. This is essentially driven by delta G and manifested through different bacterial populations in exchanging electrons. This is just on the right here. You can see this would be very well mixed sediment core. And as you start to go deeper, you start to get into some of the sulfides and iron sulfide abundances. So that's one aspect of controls on organic carbon burial. This can change very quickly if organisms are involved, and bioturbation is important. You can change and bring down the oxygen into deeper layers. It can also happen through physical mixing. So one of the things that we're interested in doing that's very important if you're looking at organic carbon burial is to be able to know where the depositional pathway is. So if you come out from a river, it doesn't matter how much you know about the organic matter or even the primary productivity of that region. You really need to know, in terms of carbon burial, where are the primary depositional places that this material, that particles are actually being deposited on the surface. Without that, it's really, really very difficult. So we have to use things like lead-210, beryllium-7, thorium-234 to use these tracers to actually track where particles are being deposited. And then you can move into the organic composition and so on. This was basically looking at the sediment mixed layer. And we did some machine learning to develop where you find these mixed layer depths and how it varies around the coastal margin. Once you get a sediment mixed layer that's about 60 centimeters or more, you start to really lose organic matter burial efficiency. That is, you're getting a lot of deep mixing. So this was just something that we would not have ever been able to do without machine learning to really constrain where these sediment mixed layers are in this very, very dynamic, heterogeneous systems. Now, the other tools that we use are basically looking at what the sources are. And many of you know you can use elemental ratios, you can use stable isotopes, you can use NMR, biomarker analyses, and compound specific. One of the interesting things with this pyramid is that the higher, the less specific these proxies are, the more inclusive you are of the bulk pool of carbon. The more specific you get into specific lipid biomarkers or pigment biomarkers, you have higher specificity, but you're actually looking at less of the total carbon pool, so there's a trade-off. So these are the two tools that we've used, radionuclides and a lot of these different tracers that I won't spend a lot of time talking about. So let's start with this, I'll work from here. This is this paper that we had on mud. And basically, we were looking at where is mud accumulating and where is it being lost in the Anthropocene. And most of the loss is with wetlands on the coast. There are lots of other places in these glacial lakes, certainly areas where mud's being held back in river dams and so on. But usually the deltas and the blue carbon communities are the ones that are most vulnerable to loss. So if we start here with fjords, fjords, for those of you who may not know, these are carved out by glaciers. You can see here they typically have a sill. And so the bottom of these fjord regions are very low in oxygen because of poor exchange. And we started looking at these systems. This particular is an example of an Arctic fjord system where glaciers are retreating. This would be something that you might find in Svalbard fjords in Norway. But I had a student that did some analysis, global analysis of what was known about these fjords, and he estimated that about 11% of all the carbon buried in the global ocean is in fjords, which was really, really strange because fjords do not have a very large footprint when you think about their global distribution. But then when we started thinking about it, we said these are sort of little settling chambers where you have very steep slopes, material can run in very quickly, and yet in the bottom it's really low oxygen, so maybe they are really sort of these little burial pools. So just to give you a couple of examples of some systems we've looked at, this is up in southeast Alaska, and we're looking at marine, biospheric and petrogenic material. So these are different fjords here. This is organic carbon accumulation rate. We're looking at petrogenic, terrestrial, and marine. 3 different pools of carbon getting buried in different types of fjords in Alaska. And if you look at the non-glaciated systems, you can see that most of it is marine. If you look at the glaciated systems, you can see that most of it is petrogenic material. So as these glaciers are actively releasing material, ground up material, you're getting this rock carbon that's being buried. Now going back to what John Hedges was thinking about when he thinks about the importance of petrogenic material or kerogen, how important is that? How important do we really need to think about that when we think about sources and sinks, or we think about material moving from point A to point B? When I was a graduate student, most people just looked at it as fairly inert material. It's millions of years old. Microbes are not going to be interested in something like that. Well, that's changed. We basically have petrogenic organic carbon being consumed. As we've used many omic techniques now, we know a lot more about the microbial community. Why these microbes would want to be interested in eating petrogenic carbon, I have no idea. Microbial people could speculate on that far better than I could. But you can see to have, I mean, even up to 55% efficiency in consuming this. This again is Svalbard. So again, now even moving petrogenic material from point A to point B, we need to be mindful of that. There's also evidence of this going across the floodplain of Brazil, of the Amazon, I should say, where people see the breakdown of petrogenic material as well. So it's not just up in these colder habitats. Another fjord that a student just worked with me on is up in Swedish fjords. And so we're collecting many types of, from many locations, Iceland, Greenland, all over, to try to get an idea if that 11% number is really valid in terms of their importance globally. And fjords are just totally different no matter where you go. They're very distinct. And this, what Emily found in this paper is that these are different fjords in Sweden. And basically, the B fjord is the one that has an anoxic water column. And these two are more well mixed. And basically, what this study showed was that the efficient burial in all of these systems, it wasn't really that different, meant that having a low oxygen water column in the B fjord really didn't enhance the organic carbon burial rate. It was really too rapid, too short of a water column to really make a difference. So despite that, we find that the fjords are burying similar amounts, even though there's a very distinct gradient there. If you move to the coastal wetlands, or what some might call the blue carbon, we know that these systems have gotten a lot of attention. You can see the efficiency of these blue carbon systems compared to different terrestrial systems. I think the blue carbon mania has grown a bit too much. I've seen people refer to sinking blue whales, dead blue whales, as blue carbon and things like this. I just don't see that as a blue carbon in the way we typically think about it. A lot of that's just going to be burned off and remineralized. I've argued a lot with people about also seaweeds. And again, they're very good at sequestering, but basically once they start tumbling and they're released from the rocks, you get a lot of burn off. So again, the blue carbon habitats more traditionally are where you get that direct connection with high productivity being injected into a low oxygen environment with mud to help organomineral binding. So those kinds of combinations are really the thing that makes blue carbon in the traditional way efficient burial. Now, one of the things that's happening, of course, globally is that many species are moving poleward as we start to get warming of the planet. And this is similar for mangroves. Mangroves used to exist just in southern Texas and southern Florida. Now they're all the way through the Gulf of Mexico and all the way up into parts of Georgia, because the freezes are not taking out the young prop plants as they settle in. So we're getting this invasion of mangroves into marsh grass. And we looked at this on both sides of Florida, the Atlantic and the Gulf side. And basically, this is the St. Augustine side, and this is sort of this is the Gulf side. And what you see here is looking at carbon, total organic carbon here with depth. And this particular pattern that we see is that where you find the mixture of the marsh and the mangrove, where the mangroves have invaded the marsh and both exist, because you have three different habitats: marsh, mangrove, and the transition zone. And so these transition zones are quite interesting, and looking at how that affects carbon burial as you go through this transition of marsh to mangrove is going to really vary a lot as we look in different regions, depending upon the history of those systems. I had Pakin just finished with me. He likes colorful graphs, and this is actually the fourth edition of after me telling him to make it less colorful. But he's really did tremendous work. He had measured almost every biochemical that you could imagine that traces below ground production, roots, above ground production. We have black mangrove, red mangrove, and 2 different marsh grasses. These mangroves are invading these marshes up in the panhandle of Florida. And he's very interested in looking at the organo-mineral associations. And what we find is that when he starts looking at the amount of sort of free detrital material, we see much more abundant free POC, not mineral bound in the marshes. But we do see some iron oxide mineral binding in the 2 marshes. And that diminishes as you move out in this direction. If you look at the black mangrove, you see that there's lots of binding of organic matter with non-iron oxides, just other clay material. So he looked at these different pools of clays, again, the whole importance of mud, and measured all of these different chemicals. And what he found was that if you see here, with Rhizophora, the red mangrove, we see that the iron oxides, it's just the role of iron oxides in preserving organic carbon in red mangrove diminished. And we're wondering what's going on there, because both of them seem to do well with clay particles in general, both of these. And what's happening here, we believe, is that this may be from tannic acid, high amounts of tannic acid in these particular plants may be inhibiting the type of bonding that you get. So you can see the complexity that you deal with here. Pocken was also, as I mentioned, able to find biomarkers that help distinguish between a below-ground biomass and above-ground biomass, and ultimately what gets preserved over time, which is a real difficult thing to track once you lose identifiable material as this material decomposes. The river dams and coastal deltas, the next section, we're close. These are some of these steep gradients that I was talking about. As a result of damming, you start to create differences in confluences, appropriate for this conference as named. And as you move from the dam down to the delta regions, you start to get significant effects of holding back sediments and starving the deltas with sediments. And so many of these deltas that are in this red area are not able to keep up with sea level rise. So this is the only dissolved organic matter slide that I have, just because this happens to be, most of it, again, is sedimentary dynamics. And one of the things we've been interested in is looking at priming, where you see the potential effect of algal DOC interacting or increasing the consumption of terrestrial organic matter, DOM. And I bring that up now because we were talking about these steep gradients where these confluences are. And so as you start damming these regions, you start to get these steep gradients changing where the confluences occur. And the only thing I'll say, this is just really work that we did in the Amazon with Jeff Ritchie and Nick Ward when Nick was a postdoc with me. And we went to these confluences and we found very, very high concentrations of CO2. Oxygen dropped down, and we said, what's going on here? We wondered if there was priming going on at these confluences. And if you're interested in reading more about that, we used labeled isotope material, terrestrial material, and we found out that, in fact, these hot spots of CO2 evasion, where you find green water mixing with the main stem Amazon brown water, we see this breakdown of terrestrial material, again, from algal DOM. We did not do the microbial work to fully hash this out, but it was quite interesting to think about the extent of priming that might be occurring if you look at how extensive these confluences are. So if you move up into the watershed and we think about some of these damming effects, I was working with some of my colleagues at Ocean University of China, and they developed a water regulation program where they release water and some of the sediment water, clean water and sediment-laden water. And basically, this whole idea was to help rebuild the Yellow River Delta, which was being starved of sediments and lost. And so this is what the delta looks like, 96, and you can see it down here. These are the years, and this is the area of the delta. And you can see from 2002, the delta really begins to grow. You can see the growth rate, kilometers per year, right? And so again, this is the Anthropocene. This is what the coastal zone is like. It's just a totally unpredictable system, whether it's natural systems or whether humans are now recreating deltaic systems. And what does that mean in terms of organic matter? So if you look at the types of material that's deposited, this is petrogenic, pre-age soil, terrestrial, and marine. As you start building and rebuilding this delta, you get all of these different pools of organic matter. What's that doing in terms of the delta being a net sink and source, and how do these pools interact with each other, the dissolve, the particulate fraction? So again, humans changing the dynamics of these major delta systems, these big global deltas. Mississippi is one that's well known. I was a Tulane student. Of course, I lost my home and everything as a professor at Tulane, which made me leave Tulane and go to Texas A&M. So I know a lot about living on mud. And you can see all of this marsh that's net loss. Again, much of this from damming upstream. And you can see there's a lot of metric tons of carbon lost as a result of this. I had a student that we found one particular area, this Wax Lake area delta, that was built in the 1940s, again, to control flood. Again, this is human-created phenomenon. So we have an embryonic delta. This delta is about 60 years old. It's basically a chronosequence. You can see the vegetation as you go from near shore out. We said this is a really interesting delta to actually look at how these deltas grow, just as we were looking at with the Yellow River Delta, and see see how it changes. How is organic matter getting stored over time with different aging and development of below and above ground plant communities? And one of the things that Mike was interested in looking at was the importance of reactive iron. About 15% of the carbon preserved in that newly formed delta, mostly through ferrohydrite and hematite, and we can identify these different pools using Mossbauer. But basically, one of the other interesting things is that when you start looking at the molecules that are binding to these different clay particles, we see there's preferential retention of aromatics and lignin-derived organic matter with these reactive minerals. So again, the types of organic interactions, as I mentioned before, in terms of the bond strength and all of that, is quite important, and we're getting better feel for that. But again, it's very difficult to make predictions about how long that carbon's going to stay in these systems because we just don't know enough about some other variables. Permafrost is, I just have this one slide. Another delta, the idea of bringing in a higher latitude delta. And we have these two rivers. This is permafrost, continuous permafrost system up in Alaska. And one of the things we find is that we see, when you go out to this deltaic region, you see long-chain fatty acids that are almost 3,000 years old. And you know that that has to be coming from permafrost. There's no way that long-chain fatty acids would be around very long in the natural cycling. So where is this coming from? Throughout this whole system here, my headset's coming off. You have this basically bank erosion and permafrost being released, and it gets rapidly shunted to the coastline. And you can see that in this particular case, in the Anthropocene, we're actually adding things to a delta as opposed to holding them back from damming. And in this case, over the last 160 years, we've been adding a very, very reactive material in permafrost because it's old, but it's very labile. My last few slides are related to an old question, again, that goes back to one of Hedges' ideas, and that is, again, if you looked at a lot of regions of where rivers are bringing terrestrial organic matter to the coast, you look in the sediments and you say there should be more terrestrial material here than really exists, than what we were typically finding based on some stable isotope models. Only 30% of what was predicted from rivers was actually in the sediments. Well, we know a lot more about where that material went, and in recent years we've been looking at transport to these deep sea canyons. And in this particular case, we see lignin as you move from the near shore out to the canyon. Lignin, a biomarker for terrestrial material, as you go offshore, decreases, right? And so lignin is being broken down as it's being transported out from the nearshore mud waters of the Mississippi. And basically, one of the interesting things is that it's not just being, what is it being converted to? It's being converted to this material that we used high-res mass spec in collaboration with Pat Hatcher and others. And basically, it's this carboxylic-rich allocyclic molecules, these CRAM molecules that are very, very stable. So you can have a molecule that's known in a plant, transported offshore, and then you measure lignin and you say, well, what happened to that lignin? Did it move into CO2? Was it just remineralized off? Some of it was, but some of it was actually converted into other more stable compounds that you would not be able to measure if you were just measuring lignin. So there's these other really complicated molecules that are forming that also are important in these questions. So finally, this global turbidity current pump is something that we're currently working on. We just had cruises off the Mississippi and off of some of the canyons off of the Northeast. And basically, we're finding that these canyons, this is a big debate between lots of geologists. Many geologists feel that these canyons are not communicating with the nearshore, and some believe that they actually are important. So this may be another place to actually shunt organic matter out and bury it, if it gets buried efficiently out there. If you look, and what's quite remarkable here, this is you think about terrestrial organic matter actually getting shunted out in deep water. This is off the coast of Madagascar, and this is in 4 kilometers of water where people are actually working with fiber optic cables, not what you would expect in deep water. So again, this communication between the nearshore and offshore with terrestrial productivity still remains to be resolved. My final slide is, if you look at these 2 quotes, I would be remiss not to say something about how science is basically under attack in the US. And if you look at the quote on the left, says, "We must also act as guardians of the interests of science, knowledge. Our first duty is not to let the higher education institutions suffer during this period of social upheaval." You look on the right, you see no matter how one chooses to act, it's never been more important to muster collective sustained action to protect science. So these are from 2 scientists. One is Vernadsky, back in 1905, in the Tsarist era. The other is in the latest issue of Science from Holden Thorpe. So science, history repeats itself. We have our own czar now in the United States, or alleged to be one. And I think I try to do what I can to help the young people stay interested. It's really great to see the attendance at meetings like this. The meeting I was just at in Vienna also had record attendance. So don't lose hope. You can see Vernadsky was cheering people on very early on. Apparently his apartment was a hotbed of activity for revolutionaries. And one of the few things I've started to do is to write op-eds. And this appeared in The Hill, where I was criticizing Lee Zeldin's support of changing basically the whole regulation of CO2, what's considered greenhouse gases, the endangerment law. And so we have to just keep moving ahead, and I always encourage the young people to stay focused on what you're doing. I think you're very good communicators from very early on in terms of using your phone, so I think you have the ability to do that and remain strong, and I wish you the best, and if anyone's interested in talking with me or communicating with me as younger folks, please feel free to contact me. Thank you very much. I guess we're out of time. I mean, but I'm happy to answer questions. I mean, it says no time left, but I'm happy to do that if someone wants to ask a question as they're heading out to lunch. I can't see if you're out there, so just please speak if you come to the microphone.
Does it work? Hello.
Okay, hi.
Thank you, Dr. Bianchi, for your brilliant talk and everything. So I have two questions. I will be very quick. The first one is that the iron-associated organic matter that we see is 15% in this land-ocean transect. How much of it do you think is detrital, preformed on land and then transferred into the system? And how much of it can be oxygenically formed because of these biogeochemical processes that are happening in situ? Do we have any estimation of that? So that was...
Yeah, I mean, again, looking at the autochthonous and allochthonous proportions as you move offshore is always been a challenge. And you know, what's really interesting is that if you look at where the big sites are, near the big rivers that are shunting this material out, whether it's particulate or dissolved terrestrial material, those systems also tend to be very high productivity areas, right? So in the Gulf of Mexico, I mean, really off of the Mississippi is where 90% of the primary productivity is in terms of fisheries and everything else off of in the entire Gulf of Mexico. So we believe that priming is particularly important where you have these two pools contributing to the burial in these systems. And looking at the rate of priming is going to control how much of the terrestrial versus the allochthonous ultimately gets buried. I'm not sure if that's specifically addressing what you were asking.
More like mineral organic associations, because they can co-precipitate in situ in the system, or they can be transferred from the land to the system. Now, my question is that do we know how much of it can happen in situ because of biogenic activity, or like how much of it is transferred? But
yeah, I mean, I would say we know very little about that.
Mm-hmm. And very quickly, the second one, when we fractionated this organic matter that was associated to iron and clay and non-mineral associated, what type of fractionation did you use? This was chemical fractionation, or was it density fractionation?
Well, you know, there's some interesting work coming out now on how some of this material gets fractionated over time, and how that potentially impacts the stable isotopic signature. I would say I would say again, I think it's too early for me to really give you any sort of conclusive remarks about how that kind of fractionation within these different iron oxide pools are contributing.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good questions. If you folks could speak louder,
Yeah, is this good?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay,
I can hear
great.
that much
Awesome.
clearer. Yeah.
Sorry, that was probably really loud, but great talk. I was just really curious about you're obviously like organo-mineral interactions were like a very common theme, and I know like for example in like the Hudson Bay lowlands and like bogs and peatlands, it's also an important thing. But like iron content and the types of minerals can really change spatially. Is that something that you come across in the mud of the places you study? And is it something that's more based on like underlying geology or like things coming in from rivers? Or is that something to think that it's changing through time? I'm just curious about like how the minerals may change alongside.
It turns out that in the nearshore regions, the availability of iron has not turned out to be a problem as much. I mean, that's been less of a factor in some of the work that we've done, because we've thought about that. You know, how important is the bonding? How important is pH? How important is presence of different organic acids, as I just mentioned with Pocken's work, in terms of precluding effective iron binding with organic matter? The short answer is I think that, again, in the nearshore being fairly rich in iron abundance, we don't really see that as a big factor in terms of just the overall drainage basin geology right now, anyway, in the systems we've looked at. But these other variables are yet to be determined.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for the lovely talk and the summary about the mud. I want to ask you something outside the mud that is relevant or related. So there's lately a lot of interest when you try to sum or balance the carbon on lateral fluxes of dissolved organic and inorganic and alkalinity from all of these systems to the coastal ocean. People are starting to talk about natural ocean alkalinity enhancement from these systems. What is your take about that component of the carbon cycle from estuaries, mangroves, blue carbon systems?
Yeah, I mean, one of the really interesting things, thank you, Dina, that's a good question. Particularly even with the blue carbon coastal habitats, we're seeing that there's more and more evidence of alkalinity export from these particular systems, and what might that mean in terms of their overall role in sequestration or balancing the budget in terms of look at what gets sequestered and what's getting preserved in the sediments if you're having this efflux out. I would say another interesting aspect of that I think is quite important, it's a little bit off from what you're saying, is that I'm finding, I was talking to Pete Raymond at Yale, and with all of this seeding that's going on of things like olivine to enhance weathering in the coastal regions, farming as well, we're starting to now see that there may be very, very high concentrations of DIC that are, the calcium carbonate that can actually start precipitating in rivers. So, you know, I mean, we've now saturated the system, but the drainage basin is doing what it should be doing, and it's taking some of those products of sequestered CO2 and putting it in the rivers, which is not something that people really thought could even happen in terms of precipitation. So that's a big area now as well. So I think when you look at the river estuarine margin there's this blue carbon export of alkalinity that's a real big unknown. And now more recently, I would say very recently, people are starting to stop and think about this